Helena, her red hair tangled by the treacherous Cape Cod wind, felt a chilling shiver run down her spine. It wasn't the late afternoon cold, but a premonition. During the luxurious Miller wedding rehearsal, the white tent warped in her mind's eye, its fabric tearing as a distant rumble of thunder intensified. The smell of wet earth and twisted metal suffocated the sweet aroma of the roses she herself had arranged. The vivid vision of a collapse filled her mind, followed by a disturbing silence. Helena, 28 years old, a talented florist and bridesmaid, tried to shake off the image, but it persisted with terrifying clarity. Her green eyes fixed on the imposing structure of the tent, imagining the twisted metal and torn canvas. The sound of the sea beating against the distant rocks seemed like a grim omen, a warning of what was to come. "Are you nervous about your speech?" "A vision," Helena insisted, feeling her face flush and her heart pound uncontrollably. "The tent ... it's going to collapse. A terrible storm, the worst Cape Cod has ever seen. It's an old superstition, but I feel it's real." David rolling his eyes and Sarah exchanging an exasperated look with him. It seemed Helena was losing her sanity right in front of them. The wind that had whispered now howled, rattling the windows of the guest house where Helena was staying. She watched the trees bend violently, their leaves rustling dark secrets, like ghostly voices in the dark. A premonition, more persistent than ever, still haunted her. She felt as if she were playing chess with fate, each move a desperate attempt to anticipate the next fatal play. The salty scent of the ocean mingled with the damp smell of earth and pine, emanating from the nearby forests, creating an oppressive atmosphere. The temperature dropped drastically, and Helena huddled under a heavy blanket, fear keeping her awake, her ears alert to any sound from outside, awaiting the manifestation of the storm she had seen in her premonition. Every creak of wood, every beat of the wind against the windowpane, was a reminder of what was to come. However, something in the intensity of Helena's gaze, in her choked voice, and the tremor in her hands made them hesitate. After all, such a talented florist, and more importantly, a bridesmaid, wouldn't make such a fuss without a compelling reason. After much insistence from Helena and an apprehensive look from Sarah, who seemed to finally feel a chill run down her spine, they agreed to postpone the ceremony for 24 hours, citing last-minute technical issues to their guests. Helena's disappointment at having to invent a flimsy excuse was visible, but the relief she felt knowing the tent would be empty was even greater. Perhaps she had managed to avert the tragedy, or at least delay it. The scene is so vivid in my head, the canvas ripping, the screams, the twisted metal falling. I saw the colors of the stormy sky, smelled the wet earth and fear, a metallic scent of blood mixed with rain. I saw the lightning, the wind tearing everything to shreds. I heard the screams and the snapping of the structures breaking apart. She gestured frantically towards the tent, as if she could point to the invisible catastrophe unfolding in her mind. Or has the pressure of arranging 1,000 bouquets gotten to you? She laughed lightly, a sound that, to Helena, was like shattering glass, reverberating in her ears. The couple, Sarah and David Miller, both in their 30s, exuded the typical aura of New England wealth. Sarah, an elegant and easygoing socialite, and David, a real estate mogul with an always confident air, seemed oblivious to the impending threat. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, but Helena barely noticed the beauty around her. The sea breeze carried the salty scent of the Atlantic, which in other circumstances would calm her, but now only intensified her anxiety. The distant sound of waves crashing on the Massachusetts coast echoed the turmoil in her soul. You can't get married tomorrow," Helena stammered, her voice almost inaudible, trembling. Sarah, with a condescending smile that didn't reach her eyes, arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "What is it, Helena?" "No, it's just ... I had a premonition." David chuckled, a dry, disdainful sound. He adjusted the collar of his linen shirt. "Helena, darling, we have the best meteorology team in Boston. There's no forecast for heavy rain tomorrow, much less a terrible storm. You must be exhausted. Perhaps you need a vacation after all this." He tried to sound gentle, but there was a tone of impatience and skepticism in his voice that Helena couldn't ignore. His clear eyes, usually friendly, now held a glint of irritation. "Please, postpone it," she pleaded, desperation coloring her voice, which now sounded stronger, almost a raw shout. Their reluctance was palpable. Night fell over Cape Cod, cold and damp. The dawn brought chaos. Furious lightning tore across the sky. Fallen trees, branches scattered across the lawn like broken bones. And the tent, an unrecognizable pile of ruins. A shiver that didn't come from the damp weather, but from a deep terror that paralyzed her. A feeling that fate had not been tricked, only delayed or, worse still, redirected in an even crueler and more insidious way. She tried to convince herself that it was just a coincidence, that the storm had indeed been very strong and caused widespread damage in the region. But the vivid image of the tent's collapse and Liam's death, crushed by a branch that looked like a twisted, gnarled arm, intertwined in her mind like a waking nightmare. The smell of pine and heavy rain, which had previously seemed to purify the air, now seemed permeated with the odor of death, a funereal and disturbing perfume. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and fear, and she felt a strange buzzing in her ears. She began to observe the other party members with a new and terrifying attention. Each of them a potential target, a next echo of the tragedy she had tried to avert. The smell of wet earth and broken wood filled the air, mixed with post-storm ozone and a faint scent of distant smoke. Sarah and David, shocked and pale, watched the scene, their faces contorted in a mixture of horror and relief. They turned to Helena, their eyes moist with gratitude. "You saved us, Helena," Sarah said, her voice choked, barely able to utter the words. "Your superstition was a miracle. If it weren't for you, we'd all be dead now under those ruins." David merely nodded, unable to speak, his gaze fixed on the debris, his face a mask of disbelief and shock. The relief on their faces was almost as palpable as the destruction around them, illuminating the empty tent for fractions of a second, revealing its imposing form before being swallowed by the darkness of a torrential downpour. The sound of thunder was deafening, echoing through the hills and making the guest house shake to its foundations, as if a giant were walking outside, stomping in fury. The wind beat against the windows with merciless fury, and water streamed down the gutters like a river, forming small floods in the well-kept gardens. Helena got out of bed, walked to the window, her heart pounding in her chest, almost escaping her throat. What she saw made her let out a sigh of relief so deep it seemed to pull the air from her lungs. The tent, once a symbol of celebration and luxury, was now a shapeless mass of torn canvas and twisted metal structures, a true disfigured skeleton covered in mud and debris. A cry of relief, almost inaudible, escaped her lips. She had done it. She had saved everyone. In the morning, the landscape was one of devastation. The relief, however, was fleeting, as brief as a flash of lightning. The next day, the news arrived like a punch to the gut, coming from Martha's Vineyard, the neighboring island, where many guests were staying. Liam, David's best man and cousin, an athletic and always cheerful man, 32 years old, known for his passion for extreme sports and contagious optimism, had been found dead in his home. The cause of death: a tree branch pierced his bedroom window and hit him squarely on the head while he slept in his bed. It was a bizarre death, as unexpected as it was brutal. Liam would have been one of the first to arrive at the tent. The premonition came back to haunt her. He would have been right in the center of the collapse, crushed by the main structure, just as he had been crushed by a branch. Helena felt a chill in her stomach. In the days that followed, A cloud of fatality hung over the wedding party, now a macabre funeral disguised. The atmosphere in Cape Cod, which had previously been one of celebration and relaxation, he seemed to be aging with each new tragedy. There was a glimmer of fear in her eyes, a spark of recognition that refused to be ignored, despite her desire to rationalize. She gripped David's hand, her nails lightly digging into his skin, almost without realizing the pain. Maybe, maybe Helena is right, she whispered, her voice almost inaudible, trembling. It's too strange, David. First Liam, now Emily, It's as if luck is against us, as if a curse has fallen upon our family for postponing the wedding. A deep wrinkle of worry etched between his eyebrows. An invisible cord of fear and distrust forming, suffocating any lingering joy. Helena felt the weight of a dark secret, of a curse unfolding before her eyes, victimizing them one by one. The scent of wilting flowers in the Miller house, brought for the successive funerals, seemed to foretell more misfortune. A funereal aroma that mingled with the damp air. Conversations were whispered, glances were furtive, and every sound seemed like an omen, a toll of the approaching death knell. Helena felt trapped, trying to unravel a macabre enigma as death circled ever closer, tightening the noose. She knew she had to do something, but what? How to fight against such an invisible and relentless force that seemed to operate in such bizarre ways? Despair began to take over, threatening to swallow her whole. Helena, please. It's horrible, I know, but accidents happen. Emily was always clumsy, always tripping over things. We can't link this to your vision. It's too much imagination, too much fantasy at such a delicate time. You need to calm down. He rubbed his temples, as if trying to ward off a persistent headache that wouldn't go away. Became heavy and tense, permeated by an oppressive silence, broken only by anxious whispers. News of Liam's death spread like wildfire, increasing general apprehension and fueling superstition among the more impressionable guests. The next to die was Emily, Sarah's younger sister, 22 years old, a cheerful and lively young woman with a promising future, who was to be one of the bridesmaids. She was found lifeless in her mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, a victim of a strange and inexplicable accident involving the grand central staircase of the house. A loose carpet, a slip, and a fatal fall that resulted in a severe head injury. The medical report stated accidental death, but Helena felt an icy shiver that made her tremble uncontrollably, a sensation of vertigo. Emily would have been there, in the path of the collapse, perhaps trying to escape the collapsing tent, suffering a similar fate of falling and impact. The coincidence was terrifying, almost a mockery of fate, a dark echo of Helena's premonition. Helena, visibly disturbed, with deep dark circles under her eyes and a pale face, tried to argue with David and Sarah, pleading with them to be careful, to notice the sinister pattern unfolding before their eyes. It's not a coincidence. The people who would have been in the tent are dying in strange ways, connected to the catastrophe I foresaw. It's as if fate is collecting its debt one by one. She exclaimed, her voice choked with desperation and frustration, almost a lament. David, visibly shaken by his sister-in-law's unexpected death, tried to remain rational, his tired and bloodshot eyes fixed on Helena. Sarah, however, seemed more receptive, or perhaps just more terrified by the stark reality. The tension between them was palpable. The trap's failure reverberated through the room, leaving the Mystery Inc. group exposed and vulnerable. Fred, with his agility, dodged a blow from Captain Spaulding, pushing him aside, which caused the villain to bump into a pile of old video boxes. Captain Spaulding was trying to get up, and the other Firefly was stunned. "Ruh-roh. This doesn't look like fun, Shaggy," Scooby barked. Daphne exclaimed, relieved. "This is the real horror movie Captain Spaulding mentioned, and these people on the tapes are the missing people. They weren't actors. They were victims." She pointed to the screen, where one of the people on the tapes was clearly identifiable as someone from the list Daphne had noticed. Velma, with the tablet in hand, was already connecting it to a large tube monitor she had found in the room. It's all just ... performance art. But the image on the screen and Velma's tablet evidence spoke for themselves. The Firefly family's macabre scheme had been exposed. The videotapes scattered on the floor were the key. She inserted one of the tapes into the VCR connected to the monitor. The screen staticed for a moment, and then grotesque and disturbing images appeared. Real people in terror-filled situations being filmed. "It's time to be heroes, Scooby," Shaggy replied, despite his body trembling. The boxes fell, scattering tapes all over the floor. "Velma, the tapes!" Fred shouted as he tried to keep Captain Spaulding at bay. But Fred, who had freed himself from the rolled-up Captain Spaulding, intercepted the Firefly, using one of the fallen armors from the trap to block him and push him against the wall, where he hit his head and passed out. Captain Spaulding and the Firefly who dodged the trap advanced, their gazes filled with murderous intent. "Now you'll see what happens to those who meddle in the Firefly family's business," snarled Captain Spaulding, pulling out a rusty knife. The chase turned into a cat-and-mouse game through the house of 1,000 corpses. They coordinated, each grabbing an end of the rug. Captain Spaulding, still recovering from the fall, tripped over the videotapes, and just as he was trying to regain his balance, Scooby and Shaggy pulled the rug with force. Captain Spaulding slipped and was rolled up in the rug like a giant burrito, falling with a thud. Daphne, realizing the imminent danger, ran towards Velma. The nimble Firefly tried to intercept her, but Daphne, with a quick and unexpected move, used her karate skills to defend herself, disarming the villain with a kick to the arm and throwing his knife away. "Nobody messes with my friends," she exclaimed, showing she was more than just a pretty face. Meanwhile, Scooby and Shaggy, who had entered the room during the confusion, found themselves faced with the scene. With a sudden idea, Shaggy saw a large oriental rug on the floor. "Let's roll him up, Scooby." The other Firefly, seeing his boss immobilized, tried to attack Scooby and Shaggy. "We did it! Bingo!" Velma exclaimed, her eyes gleaming behind her glasses. "Here's the definitive proof." Captain Spaulding, still rolled up in the rug, tried to squirm, his face red with rage. "No, you can't prove anything." Helena couldn't afford to despair, even when exhaustion and fear threatened to crush her. She forced herself to focus, to search for patterns in the deaths with a cold, calculated logic, even as her heart screamed in anguish and her hands trembled uncontrollably. She realized that the deaths were echoes of what would have happened in the tent, but in different forms and locations. To unravel the logic behind these deaths, to find the pattern if there's a common thread that isn't just a premonition, Helena replied, determination growing in her eyes, fighting against the despair that consumed her. Each death has a symbolic connection to how they would have died if the tent had collapsed. The branch was the collapsing roof, Emily's fall, the floor giving way, or the impact of debris. Your father's, the air pressure, the suffocation under the debris. It's as if the tent itself is seeking vengeance, acting from afar, demanding its sacrifice. As if fate were correcting its course. Fear was a powerful catalyst for belief, and the sequence of deaths was undeniable, a pattern becoming clearer and more terrifying. Helena's eyes were fixed on his, conveying an unsettling certainty that he could no longer ignore. They began to frantically research, to question people about small details of the victims' last nights, to try and unravel the enigma before it was too late, before the next target was hit. Time was running out, every second an unbearable weight on their shoulders. With each passing day, a new potential victim, a new echo of the postponed tragedy. The Cape Cod breeze, which once carried the fresh scent of the ocean, now seemed to carry macabre whispers, distant laughter, as if the very air was mocking their efforts, their futile attempt at control. Helena felt she was in a race against time, against an invisible and relentless force that seemed to weave her own fate and that of everyone around her. She had to save the remaining ones, including herself somehow, even if she didn't know how. And hope grew increasingly faint, finding new ways to bring about the catastrophe she had averted. Liam, crushed by a branch, as if the tent structure had fallen on him, a direct and brutal punishment. Emily, falling down a staircase, as if the canvas and scaffolding had collapsed from above, bringing her to the ground. Sarah's father, his heart stopping, as if the pressure of the air and debris had suffocated him under the mass of the tent. An apparently natural death, but with a supernatural cause. It was as if the tent had become a specter, an invisible and vengeful entity haunting those who should have been there, transforming Helena's premonition into a cruel, self-fulfilling prophecy, a piece in a macabre chess game where fate was the master player. She sat with Sarah and David in the living room of the Miller mansion, the fireplace lit, vainly trying to dispel the chill that death had brought into the room, her nails lightly digging into her skin, almost unconsciously. She seemed to be on the verge of a nervous breakdown, her eyes wide with terror. What will we do then? Are we all doomed? Who's next? Me? David? You? Is there anything we can do to break this chain, Helena? A voice was a terrified whisper, almost inaudible, trembling like a leaf. Sarah's eyes were red and swollen from crying, and David seemed to have aged 10 years in a matter of days, with deep dark circles under his eyes and an expression of despair that could no longer be hidden by his businessman's composure. Fate cannot be tricked, Helena whispered, her voice hoarse from speaking and silently weeping, almost a ghostly whisper. It merely finds a new path, more cruel and insidious, to fulfill its will. Postponing the wedding was just an illusion of control. Sarah, pale and visibly frightened, gripped Helena's hand. No, we need to understand what's happening, David. Though reluctant to accept the supernatural, could no longer deny the terrifying coincidence. Helena failed. Fate, or the curse, proved to be relentless, weaving its web unshakably. David's sister, Margaret, 35 years old, who was to be the head florist and was in charge of overseeing Helena's arrangements, was the next victim. The slow, melancholic, and distorted melody of the wedding march. Only the wind howled in Cape Cod, carrying away the secrets of a wedding that never happened. The wedding bells, once celebratory and full of joy, now sounded like a funereal lament, a dark and inescapable warning, a song of death that seemed to play only for her. Helena felt an overwhelming pressure in her chest, as if the entire tent was falling on her, slowly, silently, crushing her without a sound. Just the weight, the absence of air. Her breathing became shallow, each gasp a desperate struggle against an invisible force that compressed her. The walls of the room seemed to close in, and the air became thin, dense, heavy, making it impossible to breathe. She was no longer in the guest house in Cape Cod, but back in the tent at the exact moment of the collapse, feeling its weight and impact on her, the smell of dust and rusty metal. The sound of the bells grew louder, closer, until it completely filled her mind, an infernal chorus of condemnation, the soundtrack of her destiny. The final hum was the last sound she heard, a sound that swallowed everything, even her own consciousness. Found in her private garden in Boston, entangled in a dense wisteria vine, her body pale and lifeless, suffocated. The image of flowers and death, a knot in Helena's throat, a cruel symbol of fate manifesting in such distorted ways. Margaret would have been in the tent, near the flowers Helena had arranged, perhaps trapped under the debris, or suffocated by the dust and impact of a collapse. Helena felt her body turn cold, a shiver that ran through every fiber of her being, a chilling certainty that the end was near. She had tried, she had done her utmost, she had warned everyone, but fate seemed to have an immutable plan, an irresistible force that could not be contained. Only the bride and groom and she herself remained. The circle was closing, the siege tightening, and she felt the presence of death closer than ever. Helena locked herself in her room at the guest house in Cape Cod, her heart pounding uncontrollably in her chest, like a war drum echoing in a dark cave. The wind howled outside, an ominous sound that seemed to come from within her own mind, laden with ghostly voices and menacing whispers. The door creaked slightly, despite being locked and a chair blocking the way, and she huddled in bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin, like a frightened child, though she knew it wouldn't help. The air in her room, once fresh and clean, now felt heavy, almost suffocating with a strange scent. A subtle smell of jasmine, the flowers she herself had meticulously arranged for Sarah's bouquet, filled the air, but it was not a comforting aroma. It was a chilling perfume, bringing with it the sensation of imminent danger, as if something invisible was surrounding her, drawing closer with each passing second. The silence was so dense it seemed to scream, laden with anticipation and terror. She remembered the premonition, that terrible moment when the tent writhed in her mind, the smell of twisted metal, and that absolute silence that would follow the catastrophe. Then, echoing from the darkness of the guest house hallway, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once, it came. Silence followed, an absolute silence.